Excellent. Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation as well. So I'm going to continue on the same topic that Yolanda started with, but in my talk I'm going to talk about how to use these cascaded quadratic nonlinearities for mid-infrared frequency comb generation. And why mid-infrared frequency combs? Do you still see my slides? Yeah. So why mid-infrared frequency combs? That's because in our research group we mostly do research on laser spectroscopy, and especially vibrational molecular spectroscopy. Where
Markku, I'm sorry, we cannot see your slides. I cannot see your slides. I see your screen.
Let me restart sharing. Now?
Yeah, now it's okay. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So in most of our experiments, we use mid-infrared light and especially mid-infrared frequency combs. And for that reason, we have also spent quite some time developing these light sources, especially based on Chi2 nonlinearities. And although in most of our experiments, we use femtosecond Chi2 light sources, during the past years, we have also studied this continuous wave pumped cascaded quadratic nonlinearities. And although these experiments that I'm going to show, they are already quite old, 7 or 8 years old, I was anyway thinking that this might be an interesting topic to many of you, especially because this topic is now gaining more attention due to these very nice, interesting results that have been recently obtained with microresonators. And we'll hear more about that today or tomorrow. And also the theoretical development has been quite fast, so now we understand much better what's going on here. So in our experiments, we use free space resonators with bulk crystals, just like what Yolanda explained. And it's quite interesting that even though we have these Chi2 nonlinearities in free space resonators, the observations are very similar to what we see with Chi3 microresonators. And before going to the actual topic of my talk, I would like to thank those people who have contributed to this work. So especially I would like to thank Ville Ulvila, who did most of the experiments that I'm going to show here. It was part of his PhD work. And then Chris Phillips, who had major contributions to the theory parts. And then at the very end of my talk, I'm going to briefly mention our work on lithium niobate waveguide resonators in the same context. And there in the experimental part, Michael Stevsky had a crucial role, and in simulations, Zain Abdallah. And Yolanda already nicely explained the basic idea of this system. So cascaded quadratic nonlinearities is how we can use them for frequency comb generation, and I'll be using this abbreviation CQN here, so don't forget that. But I noticed that some of the people joined a little bit late, so just in case I will briefly repeat this basic idea. So in the simplest case, we have a CW laser that produces monochromatic light, and that light is then coupled into a resonator that includes this Chi2 nonlinear crystal, which in most cases, not always, but in most cases, it's designed for second harmonic generation. And now if this second harmonic power in the crystal grows high enough, it can start an efficient back conversion process, which can be then understood as doubly resonant OPO process pumped by the second harmonic wave. And then what follows, in addition to second harmonic generation, we also have some frequency generation that then fills the cavity modes also around the second harmonic wave. And it's really good to emphasize the importance of this some frequency generation and the back conversion processes, because that way we couple optically all these different cavity modes, which then potentially leads to uniform comb generation because of this mutual injection locking in it, pretty much in the same way as what happens in femtosecond degenerate OPOs. And this is, of course, from our Chi2 point of view, it's the most intuitive way to explain this, but there are many other explanations as well. And as it's well known, these cascaded quadratic processes, they very well mimic Chi3 processes. And in that sense, it's not too surprising that what we see is very similar to Chi3 microscopes. Then in our experiments, we mostly use a little bit modified version of this configuration. So the basic idea is exactly the same, but now as we like these Chi2 processes so much, we have two crystals inside of the resonator instead of just having one. So here, the first crystal is responsible for very standard continuous wave pumped single resonant OPO, optical parametric oscillator. So with the pump laser, we pump this first crystal here, and we generate signal and idler waves, monochromatic waves, and then it's the signal wave that resonates here in the cavity. And that's now the fundamental wave of this sequence process, just as here. So because we are internally generating this fundamental wave here, we call this internal pumped scheme. As well, this is an externally pumped one. And now, then we also generate this idler wave. And what is important here is that in the second crystal, now it's really this signal wave that interacts there and produces the frequency comb through this cascaded process. And then because of frequency mixing in the first crystal, we also transfer the same comb to the idler region. And this might look a little bit complicated, but in fact, it's even a little bit simpler implementation than the first one, because in this first one, as we saw, we have to lock the pump laser frequency to the cavity resonance. But in this internal pumped system, we don't need such locking because the resonant wave is really produced inside of the cavity. So this kind of automatically adjusts to any changes in the cavity length. And then the main reason for us to study this type of scheme is really that we automatically produce also this idler comb, which is in the mid-infrared region, which is what we need in our experiments. And then, as I will show later during the talk, in this scheme, we can also control the offset frequency and mode spacing of the comb. So in practice, the experimental setup looks more like this. So we have a bow-tie cavity with these two crystals. And in most of our experiments, we have built different versions of this, but in most of the experiments, we pump at 1 micrometer wavelength with a semiconductor or fiber laser, which is then amplified. And typically the signal wave that resonates in the cavity, it's about at 1.5, 1.6 micrometers, which means that the mid-infrared output is at 3 to 4 micrometers. You can find experimental details in these papers. And now, because it's a free space bulk system, we need quite a lot of power to start this OPO process, typically 3 to 10 watts, depending on the configuration. But for the same reason, we also then have very high output power in the mid-infrared, up to 5 watts. And now if we look at the spectrum a little bit more in detail, first for the visible to near infrared region, this is how it looks like typically. So we have the pump wave there, then the signal wave that resonates in the cavity, then the second harmonic of that signal, which is due to the sequence process. And then we have lots of other components due to different frequency mixing there. So it's kind of a composite spectrum that we get out of here. But what we are mostly interested in is really this mid-infrared region. And here you can see some examples of mid-infrared spectra. And this is not just a single measurement, but here we have actually tuned the mid-infrared wavelength by adjusting the phase matching conditions in these two crystals. So it says exactly the same kind of frequency or wavelength tuning as what we do in OPOs. And then for each of these spectra, the spectral width is limited by the phase matching bandwidth in this OPO crystal, the first crystal here. Okay, then if we look a little bit more in detail, the signal region, the resonant wave spectrum, which is easier to characterize, it typically looks like this. So if we remove this sequin crystal, then we just have monochromatic lights due to the opio process. But then when we put the second crystal inside of the resonator, as soon as the opio process starts, this resonant wave builds up so much that we start to see this spectral broadening due to the sequin process, like here. And then as we increase the power, pump power, the broadening increases as well. And now how the spectrum looks like, it very much depends on the experimental details. As Yolanda also showed, in some cases we see something like this, which kind of resembles to what is also sometimes seen with Chi-3 systems, in those cases where modulational instability frequency is much, much higher than the free spectral range of the cavity. So sometimes we see something like this as well, and then as we increase the power, these subcones kind of merge together. But in most cases, we see this kind of spectra, and this is what we prefer for the reasons that I'm going to explain later. And this is actually quite complicated even experimentally, but one of the important parameters here is the phase mismatch in the second crystal. And last year we published one paper where we collected experimental observations about how this phase matching changes the spectral properties of these cones. Okay, then to get a little bit more information about what's really happening here, so to kind of confirm that we actually have some cone generation and not just spectral broadening, we first looked at the optical spectrum with a better resolution. So this is a measurement with a high resolution FTIR, Fourier transform spectrometer, and this is already here we can see these individual modes that are spaced by cavity mode spacing, which is about 200 megahertz in our case. And of course, this could be just a collection of modes. We don't know yet if it's a frequency cone. So then we also measured this radio frequency intermode beats. So we directed the cone light to a photodetector and measured the radio frequency spectrum. So that basically has components from beating between these adjacent cone modes collectively for the entire optical spectrum. And the radio frequency spectrum, it looks something like this. So we have the first beat at rates expected, and then we have harmonics of that one. And now what is more interesting is to really look at what happens here if we zoom in to one of these beat nodes here. And it can look something like this, or something like this, or something in between. So in most cases, this intermode beat signal is like this, so it's actually quite broad. The -3 dB line width is about 1 megahertz. But then with certain experimental conditions, we see significant narrowing of these beat nodes down to the kilohertz level or even below. And here I have also plotted the first case for reference, so it's really quite drastic change. And usually these kind of, or there are also differences in the time domain. So if we take the same photodiode signal to an oscilloscope, in this first case, we usually have very strong CW background, on top of which we have this fluctuating, oscillating signal, which has an oscillation period of frequency that corresponds to the mode spacing of the cavity. And in the second case, usually, not always, but usually the modulation is much deeper and the CW background is smaller. So then next we also wanted to check whether we really have a uniform cone. So we checked the equidistancy of this cone for one of these low noise states where we had the narrow intermode beat signal. And we took the optical spectrum, and out of that optical spectrum we extracted two narrow regions using gratings. And then we basically, what we did, we compared the intermode beat signals of these two regions. You can find details in this paper here. So essentially what you get out of here is yet another beat nodes. And in this case, if the intermode or if the mode spacings in these two regions are equal to each other, we see a very narrow beat here exactly at 0. And that's indeed what we see. So within the measurement resolution of 1 Hertz, we can now say that this comb is uniform. We even repeated the same measurement for several minutes just to check that there isn't anything funny going on here. So now we know that the comb is uniform, so it's also interesting to know how we can control the 2 parameters that essentially define an optical frequency comb. So the offset frequency and the mode spacing. And as said, in this intracavity or internal pump system, we can control separately the offset frequency and mode spacing, because the mode spacing is now determined by this cavity. But then if we change the frequency of this pump laser through this OPO process, this frequency change in the pump frequency, it's directly transferred to the IFLR frequency, to the mid-infrared frequency, because the signal wave is fixed by this cavity resonance. So now if we first take a look at the mode spacing, for the free running system, it looks something like this. So it's actually surprisingly stable. The fluctuation over several minutes, it's only a few hundred hertz. So fractionally about 10 to minus 6. And then in the middle, you can see a sudden change in the mode spacing, and that was done on purpose by slightly changing the cavity length using the piezo actuator. So it shows that we can also fine-tune this mode spacing. And then to check the offset tuning of this infrared comb, we actually first frequency doubled the mid-infrared comb just to make the detection easier. And then we compared that one of the comb peaks against the reference CW laser. So we monitored this beat frequency here. And then as we change the frequency of this pump laser, what we should see is change in the offset frequency of the comb, leading to change in the beat node here. And that's indeed what we see. So when we sinusoidally modulate the pump laser frequency, we can see modulation of the offset frequency of the IFLR column. And then next we also logged this beat frequency. So we put a feedback back to the pump laser, and we logged one of the comb modes to this reference laser. So here we can see first free running offset frequency of the IFLR comb, and then when we switch on the lock, the frequency stabilizes. And this is now, it's not a true phase lock, it was very low bandwidth locking, but nevertheless it shows that we can really control independently the offset frequency and mode spacing of the comb. Well, then these results that I've showed so far, they have all been measured with this low noise state, which corresponds to these narrow intermode beat signals. But as mentioned, in most of the cases, with most experimental conditions, we actually see something like this, something very broad. And just to kind of highlight my next point that I'm going to make, I also plotted another example of such a broad beat node, where you can see clear structure. So you may guess what is causing this. And to check this, we again took a small section of this optical spectrum using a grating. And now if we measure the intermode beat signal for this narrow optical bandwidth here, the beat signal is again very narrow. While for the whole comb, if we collect light from the whole comb, we see this broad beat node. So this is kind of a signature of this kind of subcombs that we have under this envelope with slightly different mode spacings. So it's well known also from Chi-3 systems, and for example, these papers of Scott Didam's group, in those they discussed this very much in detail. So this kind of highlights the importance of cavity dispersion control, but there are also other ways to improve the performance here. And one of the tricks that we can play here is to use so-called parametric seeding, which in this case means that we slightly modulate the power of this pump laser just by a few %, but in such a way that this modulation frequency is adjusted so that it's equal to cavity free spectral range within about 1 kilohertz. And when we do this, we kind of force the entire comb to have uniform mode spacing all of the optical spectrum. So we kind of, by doing this parametric seeding, we can move from this state to that state and improve also the long-term stability of the system. Well, that leads to the conclusion. So we have studied this continuous wave pumped cascaded quadratic nonlinearities for frequency comb generation, especially for this intracavity pump system or internal pump systems, where we can get a very high output power in the mid-infrared region using near-infrared pumping. And one of the advantages of this approach from the experimental point of view is that we don't need any cavity locking. So it's kind of automatically adjusting resonance frequency there. And also with this system, we can get independent control of the offset frequency and mode spacing of the comb, which is quite important for most of the applications. And we have confirmed that the comb that we generate is actually uniform, and that we can further improve the spectral quality of this comb by parametric seeding. Then to just very briefly show how these combs compare to state-of-the-art femtosecond combs in the mid-infrared region, we did a very simple spectroscopy experiment where we kind of took this comb light, passed it through a laboratory air to do spectroscopy, and using a multipass cell, and then we detected the transmitted light using a Fourier transform spectrometer. And we did this experiment first with a femtosecond OPO comb, one of the state-of-the-art combs that we have in our lab, and then with this CQN comb, both in this mid-infrared region at about 3 micrometers. And as expected, we can observe some water and methane peaks in the air. And although the measurement conditions are slightly different here from the signal-to-noise ratio point of view, the conditions are almost equal. And as you can see, even in this kind of very basic or simple experiment, the background fluctuation is much larger for this CQN comb. So especially it's the long-term stability of the system that causes problems here. Although I should mention that here we didn't use this parametric seeding, so this was really for a free running comb. But anyways, it's promising, but there's still a lot of work to do to actually get low phase noise combs out of these systems. And finally, we have also studied the same phenomena in lithium niobate waveguide resonators. I don't have time to go into details, but you can find quite detailed description in these papers. And in this case, we used this external pumping scheme. So the pump frequency was matched to the resonance frequency here. And in this case, we were not able to monitor the equidistancy or the intermode beat signal, so we cannot claim comb generation, but we anyway see spectral broadening, similar to what we see with the bulk systems or phase-based systems. And then also our colleagues in Japan, they have actually studied very similar system, and in their case, they were also able to measure these intermode beat signals. So this is a potential alternative solution also for miniaturization of these systems. Although it has, as usual, it also has its experimental complications, which are discussed in detail in these papers. Then finally, I would like to thank funding agencies, all the co-authors, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Markku, for your very nice presentation, and which is now opened for questions again You can show your hands, or you can type your questions into the chat. I think it was very stimulating talk in terms of questions. Can I go ahead with my question? So when you insert two crystals into a cavity, I didn't quite catch what is the rationale behind two crystals. Are you doing different? Do you phase match them differently, or what's happening there?
Oh yeah, I'll come back to that. Let's look at the first slides. So the idea really here is that with the two crystals, we kind of can, in a way, we separate the pump from the resonant wave of the cavity. So the resonant wave is now the wave that is needed as the fundamental wave for the sequent process. Mm-hmm. So this is the sequent process between these two spectra here. Mm-hmm. But now, in order to generate this resonant wave, we can either pump it externally, in which case we have to lock the pump laser frequency to this cavity resonance, or with this first crystal, we can actually generate this wave internally. But maybe more importantly for our case is really that because we're interested in the mid-infrared region. Now, when we do this, then in this first crystal here, we also convert the comb automatically to the mid-infrared region. So the comb is actually generated here, but because of additional frequency mixing between the resonant wave and this pump, the comb is then transferred to the mid-infrared region as well.
Right.
That is the main purpose there. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I have one more. So did you try to characterize your signals in time domain to see if you have?
Yes. Oh yeah, that's a very important question, and I actually forgot to mention that. But well, very simple characterization is of course this. We just measure with a photodiode all the lights, and we look at it using an oscilloscope. So there we can already see quite a lot. And I should emphasize that I don't know if you paid attention, but even in this kind of low noise state, although we see very nice pulse train there in a way, this is not really long-term stable. Usually it breaks down in a few seconds or so. So if there is any mode locking, it's at least not long-term stable. And then we also tried to measure autocorrelation signals for this at the very beginning, when we kind of naively thought that we would have some sort of mode locking, but in the autocorrelation as well, we see that in most states, at least, we don't have any nice pulses. So it's more like kind of a mixture between CW background and pulsing, which is maybe, I guess it's very similar to what's usually a problem with the Chi3 processes as well, that because we pump with a CW laser, it's not energetically very efficient to use pulses. So it kind of favors usually this case where we have strong CW background. But now this recent experiments with microresonators, they kind of hint also that there might be a possibility for mode locking as well. And also what Yolanda showed, there might be these tuning steps that indicates that.
Okay, thank you very much.